Okay, well, if you look down here between where this tree is and the sagebrush rise down there is the area where the massacre took place, is somewhere in that area. And over this way you can see the line of willows going down past these houses. That's where Almo Creek is. And that's where they camped, and so they got that far away from the creek before they were ambushed and circled up the wagons right in here.
So you would think that in the morning this is kind of the campsite, and they would have moved up towards the Valley of Rocks over that hill.
Right.
And so they were, you said that somebody said that they were still finding wagon bits just up over there.
Even later on, there's a white house up here, and the wagon train started out and they were spread out over some area. And the Indians waited until the last of the wagons left the creek before they attacked.
Modern scholarly consensus is that the Almo Massacre never really took place. There are a number of reasons put forward by people who don't believe it happened, and I'll address those points a little bit later in the video. For now, I want to go over some of the evidence that's been found, and also give a brief description of how the massacre happened. There was no war in this part of the world, but a few of the settlers were said to have caused a lot of disruptions, even shooting and killing Pocatello's son. This kind of behavior supposedly was happening as soon as they entered Idaho, and by the time they made it down to the cutoff and south to the California Trail, a lot of the local tribes had already formed a negative opinion of them. And although nobody's certain about the dates, sometime around late 1861, they made their way down the Almo Pass after leaving the Oregon Trail and heading along the California Trail. At the time, there wouldn't have been any settlements in this area, but they camped in what is today Almo, specifically at a little creek that runs just south of town, and geographically understand that they were in the middle of a very open valley. They could be seen from all sides, but there was a slight hill to the southwest of them. Once you cross over the top of this hill, you go through a little valley with mountains on both sides and enter the City of Rocks. And the City of Rocks is able to hide a quite substantial force. And according to the lore of local families, throughout the night, various tribes, led by Pocatello, met and congregated on the cliffs overlooking the area. As the wagon trains began to leave, they began to come out of the rocks and show themselves. And the general layout of how wagons would leave in the morning, especially in large groups like this, is that you would wake up, do your chores, and start moving out. As such, they weren't very closely packed, and they were about a mile apart. But the attack began early in the morning, so most carts that got a little bit of a head start immediately were destroyed, and everybody in them killed. The rest of the carts appear to have made a short dash towards the canyon, but when they realized that the Pocatello forces were too strong, they began to fortify. This was done in a very similar way to the wagon box fight of Wyoming. Essentially what they did was they tipped many of their wagons over on their sides to form a wall surrounding them, and then they piled dirt behind them, which created a sort of rampart. But the immediate problem they now faced was the fact that they had no water. They had just been at Almo Creek, but they figured that because there was no state of war, they would easily be able to pass through the City of Rocks and find many natural springs and rivers just behind it. So according to local lore, for several days they were under siege, and at some point throughout this, 5 people escaped. A man, a woman, a baby, and 3 others that I was not able to identify. This lore comes from some family legends about a ragged-looking crew arriving in Ogden after they were picked up by a rescue party. The most well-known legend is of the 2 survivors which broke off almost immediately. A man and a woman, the woman holding her baby from a swaddle in her teeth, escaped underneath the ramparts and ran for the hills. They were found about 25 miles away from the site of the attack in the mountains, living off of grass and whatever dirty water they could find. By the time the rescue party had gotten there, the baby had already expired from exposure.
And you were talking about the grave of a child from the 2 people who'd escaped.
Yeah, it's down here at the end of the Clear Creek Mountains. It's way off in the distance there. It's about 25 miles away. But there's a place where we've been told and shown is where the baby was buried that died when the lady escaped and carried the baby out.
And you were telling me about the families involved, how they would maintain it. What were the relations to the baby?
They weren't relatives of the people that survived or anything. They were just...
they probably didn't even know who they were.
They probably didn't even know who they were, but they were familiar with the story and knew where the grave was, and the man was a freighter. He hauled freight from Kelton up this way towards Boise, and he would stop along the road and take care of the grave from time to time. And
If we ever found it, would you be okay with me publishing the coordinates so somebody else could take care of it?
I would be fine with it. I don't know whose property it's on now, but or if it is private property, it may be BLM. I'm not sure.
To cross the fence.
It's just across the fence
So somebody probably
along
owns
the
it.
road there.
After continuing on to the site of the massacre itself, they found that everybody had been killed. But, according to local family legends, the people who led the search and rescue effort were Durfees, and apparently the Durfees were very secretive in the things that they did. And if there were massacres here, the Durfees never really talked about it, and only later did further generations, the grandson, for example, of Mr. Durfee, actually began to talk about what their grandfather told them about. And by the 1920s, this became public knowledge.
And so this is the field that the guns would be dug up from.
Yeah, all of this area right here around this tree is the land that the Cahoon family, they homesteaded this ground and they developed it, and that's when they were plowing up the brush and plowing up the area to plant crops. They turned up a lot of guns, arrowheads, just things associated with the massacre.
And a body-sniffing dog came in at one
And
point,
we
right?
did bring a cadaver dog in. We could not go right onto that property because it's owned by a different family, and they didn't want us getting on there and finding dead bodies. So we took the dog around the outside of it, and the dog did find some places that it, what they called hit on the bodies, a couple of places, and was very interested in the area over there, but we couldn't go in there with the dog. So
Now, before you discount this idea of a body-sniffing dog encountering people who've been buried since 1861, remember that body-sniffing dogs identified the grave of John Snyder, who died in 1846 with the Donner Reed Party, with a fair degree of certainty. So it seems that body-sniffing dogs can follow a scent for hundreds of years.
And you mentioned that the tree, being a lone tree, would probably grow best because of the fertilizer.
well, that was my theory, is the things grow well where there's lots of fertilizer, and if the bodies were buried in a grave, that would stand to reason that something would grow there.
And you were saying it was a well that they were...
It was a well they were trying to dig, and it's possible that they later on more water came in, and they were, at the time they were not successful at finding water. So
Well,
anyway,
but they were trying to. It's quite rocky up on that
Yeah.
spot. When we walked across there, I was surprised at how rocky and elevated it was. And so they very likely just.
well, and then even if they didn't have water in the well, this area they would irrigate it with the creek water
Later,
to
yeah.
grow the crops, and so it would have seeped into it, and put more water there.
The couple I'm interviewing now is Janice and Kent, both of which take a very active role in preserving the history of the Almo Elba Valley. They're descended from a man who apparently is referred to only as Mr. Durfee, who accompanied the failed rescue mission in 1861.
So he was on the rescue party. And he never wrote an account of it, but you know for a fact that he was actually on the party.
Well,
The
that's
reason-
his grandchildren.
We know. Okay, first of all, Mr. Durfee was mentioned in several documents. Mr. Durfee was on the rescue party. And a couple of years ago, a neighbor came in and he says, "Oh, I've been out with Kurt looking to see where his grandfather was on the rescue." And so that way we knew who it was. So we went out with Curtis Durfee. And he's like, "Yeah, my grandpa brought me out here and showed me where I can't remember if it was his grandfather or, anyway, his father, either his grandfather or father had showed him and told him the story. And then he had brought his grandson out. So he had been told by these generations, it had been passed down in their generation. This is where the rescue the massacre happened. Grandpa was on the rescue."
Yeah, Patrick Connor, right? And so that was more of a engagement like a military type attack than a massacre.
Retaliation.
Yeah, from what we have been able to understand is that there was a lot of Indian problems in here along the California and especially the California Trail. And so Connor was dispatched to put it down, to put a stop to it. 'Cause they actually considered closing the road and not allowing people to come because there were so many problems that were happening. Most of the things that happened were in smaller groups, and there weren't. Everybody wasn't killed. It was 2 or 3 here and 2 or 3 there. And we actually found a history from an Oakley paper, wasn't it? Anyway, the paper that Carolyn found.
It was in newspapers.com. I don't remember.
It was
in
in
Salt Lake or
newspapers.
I think it was Salt Lake.
Guess, yeah. Anyway, she found an account that when we first started to read it, we thought might be the account of this massacre because there was so many things that were similar.
The Almo Massacre.
Yeah, but it did happen here, but it was only 12 wagons or 7 or 8, I don't remember. Anyway, and not everyone was killed, but some of the other aspects of it.
People going down to Brigham City for help, and the rescue party being set out, and just,
But they joined up, some of them joined up with a wagon train that was ahead of them, and some of them joined up with one that was behind. But there were wagons that were burned out and so forth that were left here. And this account talks about, as they came into the valley, that they found the remains of burned out wagons. So there had been other things happen before this one. All it showed us was that there were a lot of problems that happened in this valley and over time.
I think in the Raft River Valley, which is from Malta up here, we can document maybe 8 to 10 Indian attacks of different sizes.
This valley was beginning around 1860, 1863. That was the site of more or less an undeclared guerrilla war.
Yeah. This was where Pocatello said, "I've had it."
He'd had enough and wanted to put a stop to it.
Central to the theory of the Almo Massacre is the controversial idea that from about 1860 or 1861, this part of Idaho was undergoing a small guerrilla war waged at the behest of Chief Pocatello. And while Pocatello never declared all-out war on the settlers or the pioneers, he did opportunistically attack small groups of wagons or individual travelers. The main reason that this conflict beginning in 1860 or 1861 is never really discussed is because of the fact that the commander of the 3rd California Volunteers, which was based in Utah during the Civil War, committed perhaps the worst Indian massacre of the entire Indian Wars on January 29th of 1863. But it must be noted that this massacre was of such brutality that historians have taken to omitting a lot of the previous actions. And because of the evil nature of this war crime, a lot of people have totally omitted the fact that coordinated raids were happening all along this valley for over a year prior.
It wasn't until 1848 that gold was discovered, and then 49 was the gold rush. See?
The 49ers.
Yeah, 49ers.
And the California Trail came over this pass to the north, just as we followed it coming into town. Went through town, up into the City of Rocks, over
around the Twin Sisters.
And then on the other side of the City of Rocks, there is a pass called Granite Pass. That's the only pass on either the California or the Oregon Trail that is not a major freeway.
Basically, it's not a freeway going through it.
And that's because now you can drive across the salt flats, where before you were limited. Nobody could go across. That Hastings cutoff was really a dangerous cutoff with no water, and that's what felled the Donner Party up.
I was going to say, have you seen the museum down near the Hastings cutoff?
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty interesting to see.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So the Salt Lake alternate, Fremont, Colonel Fremont, John C. Fremont.
Well, all you really need to say about the Salt Lake alternate is that the Mormon battalion, who were sent to California with, in the Mexican War, they were coming back from California, and that's how that trail got established. Fremont knew the route.
No, Fremont was being court-martialed, and a man who had been in California, Hensley, had gone to Washington, and he and some men were packing mules, and they tried to go across the Hastings Cutoff and got mired down, and so they came this way, and they met the battalion.
But they were just with pack animals, but they had discovered the water holes and so forth, and so they left instructions and with they call it a waybill, and they left instructions of how to get to Salt Lake City without going clear up around through Fort Hall
And that would be something like a stone cairn with
Well,
instructions.
no,
No,
it
just a
was-
piece
it
of
was a
paper that
paper.
they probably just hammered
just
in with a rock.
Wow.
Yeah, really, it was just a piece of paper.
The idea here is that one of the survivors managed to get help from Brigham City, and a rescue party composed primarily of Durfees was sent up on the Salt Lake alternate. On their way back along the same alternate, they buried that young baby who accompanied the woman and young man who had survived. Unfortunately, there's no other record in history of this couple or of the child. And I want to point out that Janice in particular is incredibly knowledgeable about all of the trails. It's almost a sort of art to see where they used to be, and it takes a trained eye to see that the sagebrush grows slightly taller from all of the fertilizer even a century later, or that there are rust marks on the rock from the iron in the nails of the carts as they passed over on their way to California. Eventually, I'll put out a longer video of her talking about the trails, and I have some extra footage of her describing the route of the original California Trail.
And the first group of Mormon battalion that came back found that, and so they followed that route, and it cuts off at the Twin Sisters and goes east
And
out
they
across
go
the
to the Wagon
Snowville
Road.
Flat and so forth. On our place, you can still see the ruts of the trail that was established, not necessarily from them, but from the trail. It goes right through our property down there.
Anybody who went into Utah to resupply, and a lot of them went into Ogden area to resupply, and they came followed the Raft River, and then they met the trail at the Twin Sisters. The rest of the people came over this north, through the North Pass, and then up into the City of Rocks.
I had some pretty extensive interviews with Janice and Kent, so I had to cut them up for brevity, but I do hope to post the entire interview someday. But this is kind of a brief description of how they believe and how they were told the massacre happened. Later on in the video, we'll go into more about the politics surrounding the massacre, because there was conflict between the tribes, and quite a good deal of it at the time as well.
By the 1860s, the Almo Massacre talks about having a guide. They didn't need a guide to show them the way. They had a guide to keep them safe from the Indians, you know.
So it would be sort of an Indian guide.
No, he was
He
it was
would've
just
been
a person who'd grown up out here probably. I think one article indicated they picked him up kind of out on the plains as they were around Soda Springs or somewhere in there. Somebody kind of local that knew their way through and knew where the water was and knew what you had to do to round your cow up and to keep yourself safe.
And what you needed not to do in order to cause problems with the Indians, you know, and what to look for, and, you know, just things like that. But anyway.
So there had been a lot of negative interactions with the Indians in this area before the Almo Massacre.
The story that we have that we've gotten is that this was a large wagon train. It was near the end of the season, and apparently it had picked up stragglers from previous wagon trains. So there were a lot that joined the train as it came along, and the story is that as they were coming along, they would see the Indians off out in the distance, and they would take shots at them.
The wagon train.
The wagon train, people on the wagon train would shoot at them, which caused problems, you know, that didn't sit well with the Indians, of course. There's also the story that one of Pocatello's sons was actually killed in all of this that was going on, and that was what really put him over the top, and he wanted revenge. So the story is that Pocatello called together a lot of different Indians, not just his group, but a large group of Indians, other tribes, who had also been having troubles and were fed up with the white man. And so they gathered, and they supposedly gathered up here in what's called the Indian Grove, up here kind of above the City of Rocks. In that particular spot you can see down into the valley. And so they gathered there, and then as this wagon train came in, they camped on the Almo Creek out here. The next morning they loaded up and the wagon train started out, and because it was a large wagon train, they were strung out for probably a mile before the last of the wagon train finally left the creek and started out. And once the other wagon train, or the last of the wagons, left the creek, the Indians attacked. Those that were close down to the creek formed up into a circle. A lot of the wagons that were spread out further apparently were caught out in the open and were killed. And so then the Indians laid siege to that group for a period of time, 3 days they talk about, and they had not gotten water. And if you think about it, they knew there was going to be a pull up this mountain, up this hill, and that there would be water in the City of Rocks. And so they didn't need to carry water with them to water their animals and so forth. And so they hadn't filled their water barrels on their wagons.
So geographically, this wouldn't have happened in the City of Rocks. It would have happened.
It was here in this
It was
valley.
right down. We'll take you and show you where we understand is where it took
It's
place.
just to the southeast of the store.
And some of the evidence that you guys have about this, I remember hearing that there were guns dredged up.
Yeah, and we'll when we run down there, we'll show you the field where they found all the guns and where we believe all of the things took place.
One of the boys, he was a grandson, he's barely 80 now. His grandparents owned the house where the City of Rocks headquarters is, and they would go down, and he said we just dug up tons of arrowheads down in the area there.
And old rifles,
Guns.
they found old rifles. And they laid siege, and after so many days, there was 5 of them.
Well, they started to dig the wells.
They started to try to dig a well to get water,
And they went down fairly deep.
but they were not successful apparently. After the 3 days, there were some of them that escaped and made their way down to the Brigham City area.
And the stories, it's always a guide and a young woman that escaped and went to Brigham City.
And then there's another one that there was a woman that got out
2 women and a man
with
crawled out on their hands and
on
knees.
their hands and knees, and the one woman had a baby that she carried by holding the baby's clothes in her teeth as she crawled out through the
And see, it's my theory
brush and stuff.
that she started out with some way of either she was carrying the baby and walking, or she had something figured to carry him, and then it broke, or anyway, she didn't start out saying, oh, I think I'll carry this big baby in my teeth as we crawl out. So something happened, and that was the only thing she could do, was to grab his clothes in her teeth and crawl.
But the baby died, didn't make it, and we actually have been taken to the place where they say the baby is buried over on Cedar Creek, over here at the end of the Clear Creek Mountains. As they got into Brigham City area, they met up with Mormon settlers and told them what had happened, and they put together a group to come out on a rescue to try and help survivors. And I got here, and there were no survivors, only those that managed to escape.
They found the
they
man
found
and
the
the 2
remains.
women out on the end of the hill. They had been surviving on Rose hips and the little bit in the water that they could find there, and they were in pretty bad shape. The baby had died,
Anyway.
and they buried it there they had a butcher knife that they had been able to dig a small grave for him.
We have the names of the people who, some of the people who came out on the rescue. One of them was a Durfee, who was one of our ancestors.
Myron Bushnell Durfee.
And then there was
Ezra Barnes.
Barnes and
Doesn't sound right. And Sheldon Cutler, who was the Brigham County, or the Box Elder County sheriff. And so he was on that.
And why there's no account written in a report somewhere from him, I don't know, but there isn't.
Well, we don't know where to look.
We don't know where to look for it if there is, so anyway.
Well, how have you found their names?
Well, okay, there was I've lost his name too. I think his name was Roberts, John D. Roberts, and then I think now I got him mixed up with the Supreme Court Justice. He was a teenager who was living down in Brigham City. He saw the two survivors come into town, and there was a lot of hoopla and a lot of going on. Yes, John D. Peters. And Peters was, he was an influential church leader there. He was a banker. He was into politics. He was a very influential man. And he was extremely interested in this story. So he came out here in the 1880s on school business, and he visited with Mr. Durfee. And Mr. Durfee took him out and showed him where the massacre had happened. We're really disjointed, aren't we? And anyway,
He spoke. Was that him?
yeah,
that
yeah.
spoke?
Anyway, yeah, and then in 1926, he spoke at some kind of a celebration, and he talked about the Almo Massacre. And so what we're supposing is that he was here, because by 1926, who's going to be interested in a battle that happened, 60 years ago? So he's an old man now, and he talks about Mr. Durfee, who they've already been talking about at the celebration, and he is, so Mr. Durfee and Ezra Barnes and Sheldon Cutler, he names them as being men that he knows from his information as a child and as growing up and as researching it. He knows that those men were involved in the thing.
Once the Indian problem settled down, about 15 years later, was it?
Late 1870s.
I guess, yeah, 15 to 20 years later, he packed up his family and moved out here. And they were some of the first settlers here.
It's a beautiful place.
Like I say, we have no accounts, but the biggest evidence is that almost every family that lives here, that came here early, have some account in some aspect of it, of why they came here, or what their relationship was to the massacre.
And the story's always very close to the same.
They're very similar. We have one account where the people were coming out here. We have been told that this valley was northern Utah's main source of iron for building wagons, because they come out here to scavenge the iron that was left from the burned out wagons.
We have documentation.
They have documentation of that. And so there were apparently a lot of burned out wagons, and there was a lot of metal scattered around the valley from those burned out wagons.
I'm going to put in a little bit more information about the ongoing supposed guerrilla war that was happening in this valley, as well as some of the conflict between Washakie and Pocatello, a very real split within the Shoshone tribe. I believe that this kind of information shows that Janice and Kent have really done very deep research, and they know what they're talking about.
They spent their entire subsistence getting enough food to eat and preparing for winter. So they were stocking in salmon and drying the fish and drying the meat that they, and which leads you to the other problem. You see, the Indians, the white men came through and like, wow, this is unsettled land, and the Indians are like, oh, this is where we hunt here in the summer, and then we go here and we do the camas, and then we go here and get the pinion, so there was a clash of cultures.
And they didn't know that the Indians moved around from place to place. They didn't
No,
consider
it's
that.
totally different than back east, the eastern Indians that they've known.
Well, and then also you have to understand that the white men disrupted their migration and their food supply and so forth. And then the Indians discovered that a cow was a whole lot easier to kill than a buffalo.
So the cause of Almo might have been the slow depletion of the resources.
As a part of it, that certainly played a part of it. That was, I'm sure, played a part in Pocatello's becoming fed up with the white people coming through his territory.
So could you maybe give a kind of brief overview of some of the evidence that you have that Almo happened, and also just kind of the time basis, because there was a war going on here apparently?
Well,
There were two wars. There was a war back, the Civil War was going on, that impacted it, and then the war between, at first, okay, you have kind of two frames of thought between the Indians. You have Washakie, who is down more into Bear River and Logan and out into Wyoming. He's over a very large tribe. And then you have Pocatello, who's kind of from here, from Grouse Creek over the mountain here, a couple mountains, and then he goes clear up in past Massacre Rocks, American Falls up into Pocatello, and that's kind of his domain, has become that. And Pocatello is more hot-headed, more, and this comes from Brigham Madsen, reading him, well, everybody. But Pocatello is more, I'm done. We're not going to have this. And Washakie's like, oh, okay. We're going to get along with them.
Peace.
And he's he can get some supplies from some of the Mormon settlements, but there is this animosity almost between Pocatello and Washakie even. The one side is saying, don't fight, get along, you can handle this, go a little further, change your plans. And the other side saying, we're done, we're through.
So the two wars would be sort of between Washakie and Pocatello, and then Pocatello and the settlers?
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, to some extent. You have to understand that there were battles going on between the Native Americans, different groups of them, all the time.
Blackfoot, Crows.
Between the Blackfoots and the Shoshones and the Crows and the Shoshones and Apaches, and they were all struggling, I think is the best way to put it, to take care of their people. And they did that by expanding their territory wherever possible. After the mountain men have come in here and then the pioneers started coming through, all these wagon trains. And then they start taking all the feed and disrupting their migration patterns and so forth. And so then the Indians discover that, well, it's a whole lot easier to kill a cow than it is to go get a buffalo. And so they started to think, well, if you understand the Native American mindset, and I don't profess to, but it appears that they believe that you don't own things. If there's a need, and I need, then it is okay for me to take. But I don't take more than I need, if you understand what I mean.
And so we're left asking ourselves why the whole world doesn't know about the Almo Massacre. Well, apart from it being overshadowed by other wars happening at the time, and the only rescue party being very reclusive in their information and family histories, you also have a land battle in the 20s and 30s. And the way that this played out was there is a valley to the west, the Oakley-Burley Valley, that runs down from the Snake River down to the Utah border, and one directly to the east of that, which runs down into Almo. Well, the one to the east of that had an established route. It was the California Trail, the southern terminus of which in Idaho was the City of Rocks. and newspapermen were trying to bring attention and shine a spotlight on this area, get national park status for the City of Rocks, get a protected status, and so this was an effort to make the Almo Massacre, which wasn't really spoken about before the mid 1920s, a publicly known issue, and to bring in an outside figure, the biographer of Chief Pocatello started suggesting that this massacre was concocted in the 1920s, basically to shine attention and to shine a light into this remote valley to bring in the roads and the dams.
Brigham Madsen in the 1990s, he's written many books about the Northern Shoshone, and Pocatello was his hero. He's written a book called Chief Pocatello, The White Plume, and that comes from a description of Colonel Lander, who was one of the Indian agents who first, in I think 1859, he first interacted with Pocatello. And he was very favorably impressed with this
Chief.
Yeah, I mean, he was an impressive chief.
Wasn't there a proposal to replace the monument to the massacre with a statue of Pocatello?
Well, yeah. But you don't take down one monument that was put up over almost 100 years ago and just destroy it and put
something else
that tells one part. Why can't we tell both stories? Yeah. It's not just the pioneer story, and it's not just the Indian story. It's a story of what happened as people came across the plains.
Basically, Pocatello's biographer, in an effort to make him seem like a more peaceful figure, suggesting that the Almo Massacre was concocted in the 1920s in order to bring in the waterworks project. But if we had some proof that the idea of a massacre existed among family histories in this valley before the water project was ever proposed, then we would render his point moot. Because his point is, this massacre was only ever written about starting in the 1920s. Well, it just so happens that we have proof of a memorial taking place in the valley decades before the proposed water project. So we know that there was a family history dating back decades before the land battle ever happened.
All right. In the 1880s, there was a reenactment of the massacre at we believe, a 24th of July celebration, where Myron Bushnell and Henry Dennison, my great-grandfather, were part of this reenactment. Myron was a settler, and Henry Dennison was playing the part of an Indian, and they got messing around, and they used rifles, but they loaded them with blanks. Well, in their messing around, Myron Bushnell shot Henry Dennison in the eye with the wad from his blank, and it damaged Henry's eye. And you can see that in the picture, that he has one eye that's a little odd.
So circumstantial evidence that it's not just concocted in the 30s.
Right. It didn't happen. It wasn't made up in the 30s. It was well known before 1900.